Michaela, I mean, I would imagine you've had sort of a weird life in one respect where for a long time your dad wasn't a globally renowned figure, right? And then he became one. What was that transition like for you as his daughter to see your dad go from your dad and an academic and a psychologist and so on?
Hero, man.
To suddenly become this sort of, odd superstar of, with an influence over millions of people. What was that like for you?
Well, completely surreal at the beginning. So I remember walking down Bloor Street in Toronto when this first happened and he was still a university professor, and seeing a picture of Dad on the front cover of a newspaper, and it said something like Heil Jordan. It was something like that, comparing him to Hitler. And it was the newspaper I used to read on the metro on the way to school, and I was like, well, who knows how many lies I've been reading from that newspaper.
Well, imagine that. Journalists comparing Jordan Peterson to Adolf Hitler. Never mind that Peterson has said that he has something in common with Nazis, in that he's opposed to the radical left, and that he can see Nazi as an aspect of his personality. Forget, too, that when Marvel Comics likened him to a Nazi supervillain named Red Skull, it was Michaela's idea to hawk merch emblazoned with the slogan Hail Lobster, which of course sounds a little like Hail Hitler, which Michaela, her father, and their uncritical followers found uproariously funny. If the Petersons all but admit to being Nazis, or make crass jokes about Nazism, that's fine. But if others link them to the Hitlerite faith, the comparison will be used to garner sympathy and funding from their brain-dead adherents. The clip I just showed you came from an interview with Piers Morgan. First, Morgan published an interview with Jordan Peterson, and then one with Jordan and Michaela, who only watched some of the interview Piers conducted with her father. That Michaela dismissed allegations suggesting her father was like Hitler is fitting, given that the two interviews featured crypto-fascism, praise for the SS, empathy for Auschwitz guards, support for totalitarianism, lies about Canadian democracy, and a virtual concession that Jordan Peterson thinks he's possessed by and prays to Satan. If you think these claims couldn't be true, despite the evidence I've documented in this video, other videos, and my book, The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler, here are some questions you might want to ask yourself. Why is Peterson always going on about Hitler and Lucifer? Why has he said that, archetypally, Hitler was Lucifer? Why has he claimed that Hitler was satanically possessed? Why has he alluded to Hitler respectfully multiple times as the devil? Why has he praised, defended, and empathized with Hitler in a class wherein he lectured on Milton's Satan? Why has he venerated Hitler and Satan? And what do Nazism and Satanism have to do with Peterson's claim to be rescuing disillusioned young men from their resentment in the clutches of the far right so that they don't become Auschwitz guards, future tense, who enjoy murdering innocents? In this video, I wish to focus on Peterson's bizarre commentary on Nazism and what he calls the demonic spirit, while pointing out that although Piers Morgan repeatedly agrees with Peterson, he has no idea what his guest is talking about. Like most of Peterson's fans, when it comes to figuring out who Peterson is, Morgan is clueless. The next clip has to do with a Ukrainian Nazi who was accidentally hailed as a Canadian hero in the Canadian Parliament. It will begin with Peterson responding to what Morgan characterizes as the absurdity of his guest being labeled the leader of a quote-unquote microcult. Peterson will agree and categorically declare that he's not the leader of a cult, or, if he is, it's because liberals are idiots who are afraid of each other.
And so if it is a microcult, at least half the reason for that is that the damn useful idiots on the progressive side, let's say, are too terrified of the woke mob to come out and actually have a conversation.
Well, this leads me very
absolutely comical.
Right. Well, that last sentence leads me very neatly to your bête noire, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the man who told us that the word mankind should be replaced by people-kind, the man who virtue signals for the world and yet was caught repeatedly having blacked his face, and the man who only a few days ago joined in an ovation in the Canadian Parliament for an actual Nazi. This is a guy who, to me, embraces all that is bad about the woke virtue signaling world because he's riddled with hypocrisy. I mean, when you saw the Nazi thing last week, what was your reaction?
Justin Trudeau's mode of governance is to top each scandal with a bigger scandal. And he's really good at that.
Unfortunately, Trudeau and his government have had a lot of scandals. Peterson's ceaseless lies are occasionally rooted in truth.
In the last 2 weeks alone, he managed to go to the G20, to alienate the Prime Minister of India, to start a trade war with India, to make the Indian government so irritated they decided not to give visas to Canadians anymore. And he did that to maintain his idiot coalition with the narcissist in Canada, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the Socialists, who is just as bad as Trudeau and lacks his intelligence, which is a really pretty dismal insult, let me tell you.
Jagmeet Singh is not a narcissist, nor does he lack intelligence. On the contrary, Singh is a man of considerable integrity. But to Peterson, he would be stupid because he's not white. Also, instead of siding with Canada, Peterson stumps for India and its leader, Narendra Modi, who, unlike Justin Trudeau, has had serious scandals, ones that have imperiled people's lives and democracy itself. By comparison, Trudeau's latest scandal involves racking up a huge bill while on vacation in Montana. Modi promotes Hindu nationalism, a movement that perpetuates the myth that Hindus are oppressed. Modi has been accused of trampling on freedom of expression, individual rights, and democratic institutions. In other words, he's JP's kind of guy. Given Peterson's false claim that Trudeau antagonized Modi, he had to leave out why the heads of state really had a falling out. Acting on intelligence, Trudeau announced in Parliament that a Canadian citizen and Sikh activist named Hardeep Singh Nijjar was gunned down outside a temple in British Columbia with the help of the Indian government. Modi responded to Trudeau's charge by calling it false and politically motivated. India then suspended visa services in Canada, and there ensued an ugly diplomatic row. But let's continue with Jordan Peterson demonizing Justin Trudeau, in part because he hopes Trudeau will be replaced by Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, who's currently leading in the polls, and who's promised Peterson that once in office, he'll dismantle the CBC.
And then he called a whole sequence of protesters across Canada who are parents, led mostly by Muslims who are quite traditionalist. He called them misogynists and bigots, just like he did the trucker convoy.
Here, Peterson is defending anti-trans protesters. He conveniently omitted what kind of protesters were protesting, and the so-called Freedom Convoy, which tried to overthrow the government and whose leaders had ties to the far right and neo-Nazism. Pierre Poilievre, who has praised Peterson and recommended that people read his 12 Rules for Life, also backed the Freedom Convoy, meaning that soon Canada could have a PM who supported an attempted coup organized by neo-Nazis and who promised another neo-Nazi, Jordan Peterson, that, not to worry, Canada's media flagship would soon be laid to waste.
And then he set up the circumstance so that while Zelensky was there, there was a literal Nazi, SS Nazi yet, so like the best kind of Nazi, let's say.
Justin Trudeau made it so that while Volodymyr Zelensky was addressing Parliament, he was in the presence of the best kind of Nazi, let's say. One, it was the Speaker of the House, Anthony Rota, who made the abysmal mistake of inviting a Nazi into Parliament. And two, why would Peterson employ the phrase, the best kind of Nazi? His acolytes would insist he was making a joke, but why would he do that? Also, he's made numerous jokes about Nazism. How is it that no one seems to have noticed? Michaela's Hail Lobster campaign was promoted as a joke. The punchline is that during World War II, as many as 80 million people died. Furthermore, this is not the first time Peterson has called Nazis the best. Here's what he said about them at Harvard in 1996.
Say you're a neo-Nazi, that's a good example. To say that you're a neo-Nazi is kind of a strange thing to say, because if you're a neo-Nazi, you're the same as all the other neo-Nazis, so the you has almost disappeared entirely. You pick this group identification. Now, the consequences of the group identification are that you surround yourself with a whole group of people who think exactly like you, so there's no threat within the group whatsoever. All anomalous information is placed on the outside of the group. But the other thing that's interesting about being a neo-Nazi is that you're in it theoretically, at least as far as you're concerned, because that's the best group to be a part of, so you're very moral and upright as a consequence of your identification.
In the same lecture, Peterson said that becoming part of the best group was ethical, and that neo-Nazis represented the most optimal conceivable group. What's more, you will have noted that he said being a neo-Nazi would make you feel moral and upright. This is noteworthy because Hitler claimed that Aryans were decent and upright. It's not a coincidence. When Peterson discusses Nazism, he often plagiarizes Hitler. When I tell people this, they scoff before admitting that they've never read Hitler. But back to Peterson lying about Trudeau.
SS Nazi yet, so like the best kind of Nazi, let's say, addressing the Canadian House of Parliament.
It's not the House of Parliament, it's the House of Commons. But then Peterson is more interested in touting neo-Nazis as the best group than accurately labeling democratic institutions or describing the Canadian government, which he and his wife Tammy have branded communist. Hitler branded the Weimar Republic communist. The Petersons learn from the best.
And then when he apologized, because he eventually did, he really didn't take any responsibility and he offered his own speaker as a sacrificial lamb.
The speaker, Anthony Rota, was not Trudeau's errand boy, nor did Trudeau throw him under the bus. The speaker is not appointed by the Prime Minister. The speaker is a member of Parliament, elected by other members of Parliament. Rota is a Liberal, but when elected as Speaker, it was the Conservatives who took credit, explaining that they wanted to unseat the previous Speaker. Here's what really happened with the Nazi in Parliament. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the House. Then the Speaker, Anthony Rota, drew the Chamber's attention to a man he had invited into Parliament, seated in the viewing gallery. Rota described this man as a Canadian hero and a Ukrainian-Canadian war veteran who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians. As Rota should have known, during World War II, Russia was Canada's ally. Rota's remarks prompted 2 standing ovations from Zelensky, Trudeau, Peterson's friend Poilievre, and MPs of all stripes. Only later did someone point out that the Canadian hero, whose name is Jaroslav Hunka, had volunteered to fight for the Waffen-SS and pledged an oath to Adolf Hitler. The Canadian hero had fought against Canada. The consensus among all parties was that Rota should resign, which he did, apologetically. The gaffe was then seized upon by Vladimir Putin to smear Canadian democracy, a tactic also employed by Jordan Peterson, whose Toronto home is overflowing with what he calls Soviet art, that is, Soviet propaganda. Piers Morgan is amused by the Canadian government's inability to recognize a Nazi, yet he has no idea that he's interviewing a Nazi.
It's like, and that was just last week. And you might say, well, what's wrong with Canadians? And I can tell you what's wrong with Canadians is that Canadians have a very difficult choice to make. They can either wake up and realize that under the jurisdiction of this preposterous narcissist, we've compromised virtually every institution of integrity in Canada, which is a really bitter pill to swallow, or we can assume that everyone who's pointing that out is some sort of conspiracy theorist. And it's way easier for Canadians to swallow the latter story than to actually contend with the true ramifications of the former story. Now, unfortunately, the former story is true.
By true, Peterson means false. Canadians need to wake up because the narcissist, Trudeau, this is gaslighting, it's Peterson who's the narcissist, has compromised the integrity of nearly every institution in Canada. Only that would be impossible due to the sheer number of institutions, as well as Canada's division of powers, which distributes decision-making across federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal jurisdictions. Peterson is not describing Canada, but rather a country like Putin's Russia, which he has defended vis-à-vis the war in Ukraine, and Modi's India, which you heard him endorse while fabricating nonsense about Trudeau. Finally, Wake Up is a neo-Nazi dog whistle that comes from the slogan Germany Awake, meaning Germans should have awoken to the danger of the Jews. Peterson told an audience in Norway that they had to wake up because the Canadian government had unfairly prosecuted a neo-Nazi. He added that the Norwegian government might do something similar and unfairly prosecute them. Whether the audience understood that he was positioning them as neo-Nazis, I'm not sure, but they did applaud. But let's return to Piers Morgan discussing truth with a chronic liar.
Actually being true to yourself is probably the most powerful thing you can be, I think.
Well, you can think about that in 2 ways. I mean, the first way is, who are you if you lie? Now, I would say, well, you're false if you lie. That seems self-evident. If you're false when you lie, then who are you? You're not you. And so then whatever happens to you when you lie, that isn't happening to you.
Yeah, whatever happens to you when you lie isn't happening to you. Understand? This is the sort of wisdom that Piers Morgan and other Petersonian sycophants seem to find profound. Morgan will remain oblivious to the fact that Peterson's doublespeak was meant to serve as a segue to the subject of the spirit who lies, that is, Satan.
The theological view of that is that whatever happens to you when you lie is happening to the spirit of the lie.
Whenever Peterson talks about a spirit, he's referring to the Luciferian spirit. Across his 3 books, he associates Lucifer with a spirit at least 11 times, for example saying that Lucifer represents the spirit of reason. Please remember that phrase. We'll come back to it.
Right, and the spirit of the lie, classically speaking, is a demonic spirit, and so whatever success you accrue as a consequence of lying isn't your success. It accrues to the glory of the spirit who lies, and that's a very bad idea.
It's a very bad idea, he laughs, when you lie and the glory goes to the demonic spirit or the spirit who lies, by which he means Lucifer. Bearing in mind that Peterson has said that Hitler effectively became Lucifer, watch as he transitions to the topic of Auschwitz guards.
There are things that are far worse than dying. So if you're only terrified of dying, you've hardly begun to plumb the depths of existential catastrophe.
Death is fairly...
You just don't have an imagination.
What could be worse than dying?
Being a prison guard at Auschwitz?
But you'd still be alive, even if you were witnessing horror. Is not death the
Oh
ultimate...
no, I'm thinking perpetrating it.
To be certain, he's been thinking about perpetrating it. Note how he fails to unpack what it is, since he was 13. Who would say this but a born psychopath?
Right. You mean...
How about being an Auschwitz guard? How about being an Auschwitz guard who really enjoyed his job? How about that? That's worse than death, as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
I mean that.
No, I see that.
That's hell, man.
Yeah, it's a living hell.
That's hell.
Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
He just expressed empathy for and started to get teary-eyed about not the Jews or other victims of the Holocaust, but a Nazi victimizer who enjoyed cruelty. As I keep saying, this is part of a pattern. Again and again, the amount of empathy Peterson expresses toward victims of violence, including murder, is 0. However, he praises and defends mass shooters and Nazis, nearly crying when describing the plight of a sadistic Nazi war criminal. Think back to what he said to Morgan about the Nazi in Parliament. Did he demand to know why that Nazi had been invited, or what he was doing living in Canada? Did he echo the sentiment of journalists, saying that the event should prompt a discussion about other Nazis living in Canada, and why perhaps 2,000 of them were allowed to immigrate here after the war? That would have been difficult because Peterson recently told an American audience that the number of Nazis in Canada was 0. And instead of becoming indignant about the foolishness of Anthony Rota, Peterson blamed the matter on Justin Trudeau, while laughingly calling members of the SS the best kind of Nazis. In the next clip, Morgan will ask Peterson if hell really exists. Be aware that Peterson has said that hell is real and the place where schizophrenics dwell. He would know because he was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 2020 in Toronto by a team of physicians. He has also said that Auschwitz was hell and that he could have worked there as a guard with happiness and feeling deeply satisfied. Peterson would have liked to make others experience the sort of hell that he routinely experiences due to his mental illness. He's admitted that he suffers from mental illness and that it runs in his family. He told Piers Morgan that it sometimes makes him cry, like he nearly did when sympathizing with a Nazi camp guard.
But do you think think there's an actual hell, Jordan? Is there somewhere that people like that go to which is hell?
Oh, definitely. I try not to speak about things that I can't speak about. But does hell exist? It's like, study history and see if you can figure it out for yourself. I mean,
does heaven exist?
There's nothing that's more obvious than that hell exists.
So does heaven exist?
Mao's China was hell.
He's adamant about hell existing, but when asked if heaven exists, he's just not interested. There's nothing more obvious to Peterson that hell exists because he's schizophrenic. In Maps of Meaning, he writes about descending into hell due to a psychological split he experienced in his early 20s. Thereafter, he became obsessed with the horrors of Nazism and communism, along with the prospect of nuclear Armageddon. And if hell is real, we can deduce that Satan, who Peterson is always going on about, is also real. Moreover, Peterson thinks that Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and other mass murderers, including mass shooters like the Columbine killers, were satanically possessed, as he has stated or implied on multiple occasions. He often talks about atrocities perpetrated by mass murderers and asks, archetypally speaking, what's at the bottom of it all? But what he means is, who's at the bottom of it all? The answer would be Lucifer, a belief provided to Peterson by the psychosis which accompanies his schizophrenia. Schizophrenics can become obsessed with or believe they are possessed by religious and political figures such as Jesus Christ, Beelzebub, or a head of state. Hitler, of course, was Germany's head of state and compared himself to Jesus Christ and Milton's Satan. Hitler was deemed by American intelligence to be suffering from borderline schizophrenia.
The hell that I see as a potential on earth is sufficient as a deterrent, and it's of sufficient reality. You know, you can ask, well, is it eternal? Well, I would say, well, look, all totalitarian states are variants on a theme.
That theme is Satanism, which, to Peterson's way of thinking, is synonymous with specific types of totalitarianism, chiefly Nazism. The hell that is real is not, say, the biblical lake of fire, but the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz, where Peterson would have liked to work.
And that theme persists. All archetypal stories are eternal. Everything that happened in the Bible happened and is happening and will continue to happen forever. It's part of the eternal human story. It's hyper-real. And heaven and hell are part of that.
Heaven and hell are part of that. And Peterson likes to say that Milton's Paradise Lost represents a vital supplement to the Bible because it tells the story of Satan's rebellion in hell against the Jewish God in heaven. Peterson is talking about the epic battle between good and evil, and given that he weeps about the plight of Nazi guards while ignoring the fate of their victims, can you guess which side he's spent most of his life rooting for?
I've spent my whole life trying to determine how you get as far away from being a camp guard at Auschwitz who enjoys his job as possible.
By promoting morality, decency, empathy, and democracy? No, Peterson is opposed to such concepts. For example, he says that empathy is merely a mask for liberal totalitarianism, or what he calls the woke mob. What advice does he have, then, to stop us all from killing Jews in death camps with enjoyment?
One of the things I've realized in recent years, for example, is that you are far from that if you're engaging in your interactions with the world in the spirit of voluntary play.
Oh, it's voluntary play that will prevent me from becoming a Nazi who enjoys slaughtering innocent men, women, and children. Thanks to Jordan Peterson, a man who has said that if we remove our cerebral cortex, we could live like the animals in a state of bliss, I now have the cure.
You know, and we're playing during this conversation, and Joe Rogan plays on his podcast all the time. And
yeah, like when Rogan repeatedly uses the N-word, or promotes COVID-19 conspiracy theories, or claims that killer whales held a conference in which they voted to abstain from attacking humans after they observed a bomb being dropped from an airplane. Do you see how such voluntary play could prevent listeners from being drawn to the far right?
If you're in a playful state with your wife, your marriage is optimized. And the state of play is the opposite of tyranny. And that's why it says in the Gospels that if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to become like a little child.
And Peterson will act as your father. Note that in Mein Kampf, Hitler outlines what would need to transpire for Germany to become the kingdom of heaven.
So you want to reinstate that open-eyed, wide-eyed acceptance of life that is the precursor to voluntary play.
Allow me to translate. First, you accept the all-seeing eye of Horus, an image of which you can see here over Peterson's shoulder, and here on a PowerPoint slide that JP displayed at a TEDx talk. The all-seeing eye of Horus within a pyramid was a symbol employed by the English Satanist Aleister Crowley to represent the devil. In 12 Rules for Life, Peterson writes about a vision he claims he had, wherein he was Horus flying over Egyptian pyramids. Peterson has spoken and written about what he learned from the occult in statements that can be traced back to Crowley. Crowley's slogan was, "Do what thou wilt," meaning disregard stultifying Jewish morality and do evil. Crowley was heavily influenced by Milton's Satan. And here we see the image for Rule 5 from Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. It shows an adaptation of Milton's Satan being flung out of heaven and into hell, along with the phrase, "Do not do what you hate." In other words, do what thou wilt. Do what the Nazis did. Do what the Columbine shooters did. Maybe one day, Peterson will shed a tear for you.
You want to develop your character to the point where that's part and parcel of your life on an ongoing basis. And that's allowing that spirit of the Logos to inhabit you. That's another way of thinking about it. And you can certainly aid that with prayer.
By the spirit of the Logos who can inhabit you, Peterson means the spirit who utters the word of God. And in Satanism, God is Lucifer. Aleister Crowley referred to Lucifer as God, the Lord, and his holy guardian angel. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed that the Bible-quoting Crowley was Christian. In any case, Peterson is talking about the spirit of Lucifer who inhabits or possesses you. You can pray to Lucifer. That's what Satanists do. Be aware that in Maps of Meaning, Peterson describes being inhabited by a voice with eyes after his psychological split, who watched and chastised him whenever he spoke. To quieten the voice, he had to stop telling lies and start telling the truth. That is, he had to start telling lies. At Harvard, Peterson said that the story of Milton's Satan was always running around and around in his mind. As he made this claim, he pointed the fingers of his right hand at his head and twirled them, as one might to indicate insanity.
People think of God as the joke is a cosmic butler. You pray to have your wishes granted. It's like, he's not a genie. You want to pray? It's like, pray about your stupidity. Here's a prayer that'll work for sure. You want to see if prayer works? Here's one. This will work. Sit on the edge of your bed. Ask yourself, what bloody stupid thing do I continue to do that's making my life more miserable than it has to be, and everyone else's life around me, that I could give up, that I would give up? But you have to really want the answer. So you open yourself up in humility to a revelation.
Again, the revelation Peterson's cult followers will supposedly experience won't signify a come to Jesus moment, but rather a come to Lucifer moment. In the occult, biblical language is inverted so as to promote evil.
You'll get an answer. It won't be one you want. That's how you'll know it's true. But if you act on it, then your life will improve. And that's a proper prayer.
Yeah.
That's what you do. Like in a metaphysical sense, the Christian insistence that you should be aware of your sins, which is in a sense an existential burden, is also the idea that you should attend to your own inadequacies and admit to them, because in doing so, you open up the possibility that something better can make itself manifest within you.
Need it be said, the something better that makes itself manifest within you is the devil. In Maps of Meaning, Peterson uses the word manifest or derivatives thereof in relation to evil, totalitarianism, and a schizophrenic hallucination about Satan. He writes about a schizophrenic patient he got to know who saw the devil at the foot of his bed. Remember Peterson saying that you should pray at the edge of your bed? Anyway, the patient believed himself to be a world-annihilating force and thought he was on a mission to get his hands on some nuclear weapons so he could blow up the world. Peterson writes, "The devil, which appeared at the foot of the man's bed, was merely the personification of his culture's conception of moral evil manifesting itself in imagination." Peterson wrote about this because in the patient he saw a less paranoid and more functional version of himself. He talks about encountering schizophrenics often. He's driven to do so by his narcissism.
And there's no doubt that that's the case. For sure that's true. But you have to do it in humility. And you have to be looking. That's why you're supposed to take the mote out of your own eye instead of worrying about the beam in your neighbor's eye. It's like there's something about you that's stupid you could fix.
Yeah.
And God will tell you what it is if you want him to, so to speak.
What he's saying is, although you're stupid, you can receive guidance if you pray to the Lord above, that is, the devil below. Watch as Morgan asks Peterson if he believes in God, and remember who Peterson's God is.
A lot of your fans, there's all sorts of Jordan Peterson groups that you can join who debate whether you really believe in God or not. So let's just get it on the table. Do you believe in God?
I don't think that's anybody's business. I think it's the most private question you can ask someone, but then I would say also, what's the right response to that? By their fruits you will know them. How's that?
He just said that you should pray, but instead of conceding that he prays to the Christian God, he flippantly said, "By their fruits you will know them." And Hitler, who also used Christianity to promote iniquity, said, "By your fruits shall ye too be known."
Let me ask you a different question then. Do you think there is a God?
I'm terrified that there might be, Piers. How's that? And I'm not trying to be a smartass when I'm making that comment either. Like they say, it's an Old Testament saying, I believe, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And that is actually about as true a statement as you could manage in such a short phrase.
Or, as Aleister Crowley said in such a short phrase, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, by which he meant Satan was wise. Recall Peterson saying that Lucifer represented the spirit of reason.
And, people have congratulated me. I was at the Buckley Institute last night. They were congratulating me on my courage. And I said this last night, it's like, you guys don't understand.
The Buckley Institute is a conservative organization associated with Yale that claims to be about freedom of speech. It's named after William F. Buckley, Jr., a stalwart conservative who was in favor of racism in the American South. The writer, Gore Vidal, who was openly gay, once called Buckley a crypto-Nazi, to which Buckley replied, "Now listen, you queer, stop calling me a crypto-Nazi or I'll sock you in your goddamn face." Peterson has made numerous negative remarks about gay men and has linked them to AIDS.
And I'm afraid, for example, of what happens when you lose control of your tongue. And I said that back in 2016 when I first opposed the Canadian government.
For tabling compelled speech laws that did not exist, that Peterson's lawyer admitted did not exist.
And people were, congratulating me. It's like, well, you're so brave to stand up to the government. It's like, I'm nowhere near as afraid of the government as I am of what happens when people lose control of their tongue. I studied totalitarianism since I was 13 years old, in depth. And I know what happens when people lose control of their tongue. What happens is everything goes to hell.
Peterson's "I became interested in totalitarianism" story changes. Sometimes he says he studied it since he was 13, and other times that he wrote an essay about Auschwitz at 13, in which he admitted that he would have been one of the Nazi guards. Also, his repetitive remarks about losing one's tongue are yet more examples of him likening Canada to one of the totalitarian states he read about, like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. He is a compulsive, persistent, and unrepentant liar, as is the figure of Satan.
I asked you if you believe in God. I didn't actually know what you were going to say, but for some reason you're reluctant to say. Why are you reluctant?
Well, okay, let's walk along that. Well, because it's not a well-posed question. It's too complicated an issue to be dealt with like that. You step into instant traps just by accepting the question. So I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing I would say is, what do you mean by believe?
Do you mean the word that begins with the letter B, that's followed by the letter E? Again, the reason why he's squirming is because God is the devil and Hitler, hence why Peterson has referred to Hitler as God, an evil God, God the Father, the Great Father, Lucifer, and the devil. You see, the spirit, or overarching God in Peterson's pantheon, is Lucifer, and this spirit inhabits mortals, or lesser gods, such as Hitler, Stalin, Mao, the Columbine killers, the paranoid schizophrenic who saw the devil at the foot of his bed, and Peterson. This helps explain why Peterson is always reminding his dupes how Nietzsche said we need to become gods, that is, the Superman, which is an idea that had a profound influence on Adolf Hitler and Aleister Crowley. The godhead of Crowley's religion, Horus, who was to usher in a new eon akin to Hitler's Third Reich, was based on the Nietzschean Superman.
What do you mean by this? What do you mean by believe? I'll stake my life on the proposition that God exists. How's that?
Remember, hell is real and eternal. Therefore God, or Satan, would have to exist.
Well,
Is that an answer? Because that's the right answer.
I would ask you, here's my supplementary. Do you ever pray?
Always.
Who do you pray to?
For Christians, this wouldn't be a trick question, but the loquacious Peterson finds himself tongue-tied. Perhaps he's experiencing a psychotic episode and thinks the government is trying to compel his speech.
The spirit that protects you from hell.
But that, many people would say, is God.
Hey, sounds good to me.
As I'm sure you gathered, the spirit that protects you from hell is the Dark Lord. Remember Peterson saying that when you lie, the glory goes to the demonic spirit or the spirit who lies.
And so you might say, well, I said I pray always. So what does that mean? I'm trying to say the clearest words I can say. And I do that by paying attention. I'm listening to the words and feeling them as I move along, thinking, is that a firm foundation in the morass?
So he prays by paying attention or listening to the words, and by asking himself if the words represent a firm foundation in the morass, by which he means the chaos in his mind. This is yet another admission that he hears a voice, like the one that chastised him in his early 20s whenever he spoke. And now I'm going to show you 2 other clips in which he alludes to hearing voices.
I started to pay very careful attention to what I was saying. I don't know if that happened voluntarily or involuntarily, but I could feel a sort of split developing in my psyche. I split into 2, let's say. And one part was let's say the old me that was talking a lot and that liked to argue and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. And I thought, that's really interesting. So now and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is strange. So maybe I've fragmented and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was, well, people have multiple parts.
He wasn't hearing voices, he was just hearing voices. And in Maps of Meaning, he cites an article on schizophrenia entitled Hearing Voices. The voice with the eyes that was watching and judging his speech is the demonic spirit, or the spirit who lies. Now, here he is at Harvard talking about what it's like to hear a voice. Be aware that he later admitted that he was suffering so badly from depression and anxiety at Harvard that he nearly resigned. Depression and anxiety often come bundled with schizophrenia, and at Harvard he linked depression and anxiety to schizophrenia.
In schizophrenia, for example, if you're schizophrenic and you start hearing voices, it appears as though there's a possibility that the reason for that is because the areas that are isomorphic with the language centers but are in the right hemisphere have been released from tonic inhibition by the language centers in the left hemisphere and are starting to become active. And the way you interpret that is, I hear voices. They aren't me. So which suggests to me that who you are, as far as you're concerned, is mostly the sum total of linguistically mediated processes that localize usually the left hemisphere, but mostly they're linguistically mediated. Which is only to say that mostly what you are, as far as your own self-regard, is a culturally constructed entity, most of which has been constructed using the mediation of language.
And Peterson was likely culturally constructed through language at this church in Fairview, Alberta, which he used to attend with his mother. Also, given that Peterson claimed that his Harvard lectures were about understanding what motivated people to participate in atrocities like the ones committed in the Holocaust, why would he have spoken about schizophrenia at all? Let's circle back to Peterson talking about the voice that provides the words that form a bridge over the abyss.
Is that a bridge over the abyss? Is that word the right word? I do that when I'm writing. I do that when I'm talking. And I do that because I don't want to be in the abyss. And the pathway over the abyss is the truth. Now, with regards to belief in God, you might say, and I know that you're not particularly religiously inclined, at least that's the theory. It's like, well, you have a character, Piers. Everyone has a character. You could say that would be the spirit of Piers Morgan. And then we might say, well, let's inquire into that spirit. If you were a hedonist, then the spirit that would be Piers Morgan would be your hedonistic whims. And that would be your God. I would say if you're a noble person, then your spirit is something elevated above your mere whims. And then there's the spirit that's inculcated within you. It's a consequence, perhaps, of your socialization.
The spirit is a consequence of your socialization, meaning it's a social construction that you internalized through the medium of language, say, from the Bible or in church. Peterson is probably aware that the schizophrenic tendency to believe oneself to be Jesus Christ or the devil occurs only in the West. Also, note how his claims that the spirit is a consequence of your socialization sounds a bit like his description of the devil seen by his schizophrenic patient, which was the personification of his culture's conception of moral evil.
In a more sophisticated way. It's actually a consequence of the spirit that you've allowed as a consequence of your choices to dwell within you.
Pardon the repetition, but he means the demonic spirit or the voice with eyes that appeared in his mind after his psyche fragmented. This spirit, squatting in his right hemisphere, forces him to tell the truth, that is, lie. Peterson would have to be opposed to non-existent compelled speech laws because he's a paranoid schizophrenic whose speech is already compelled by the evil one. Put plainly, he's bananas.
That spirit has a nature. It might be allied with the truth. It might be allied with falsehood.
The spirit might be aligned with falsehood. Again, recall him talking about the spirit who lies.
If it's allied with the truth, it's a manifestation of what has been considered traditionally the logos. The more you're aligned with the truth, the more your spirit is an avatar of the logos. And that's just, it's true.
The spirit within you, which features a voice, will make of you its avatar. You're merely its plaything, and Peterson is the plaything of schizophrenia. When he discusses Pinocchio, he says the character is a lying marionette who's controlled by forces he does not understand. Pinocchio represents Peterson, who must resurrect the father, that is, Adolf Hitler, who, as touched on, Peterson has called God the Father, the Great Father, and the jovial father of the race. The Nazis used Disney films as propaganda, and Peterson has railed against Disney films of late, describing them as woke. Again, given his claims that most of his work is predicated on what motivates, present tense, Nazi camp guards, why would he go on and on about Disney?
I don't like the argument by design. I like the argument by conscience better. So the argument by conscience, which is another string of classic theological thought, is that something dwells within you that aligns you with the spirit of reality.
Note how the spirit of reality sounds like the spirit of reason, which is how Peterson describes Lucifer in 12 Rules for Life, the book promoted by Pierre Poilievre, who also applauded the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, a fact Peterson left out.
And it's the still small voice within that was identified first by the prophet Elijah. And it was part of a transformation in the religious viewpoint in historical terms that moved the notion of God from something like Baal, B-A-A-L, a nature god, the god of storms and earthquakes, of what would you say, remarkable and awe-inspiring natural phenomena, to the voice within, and are starting to become active. And the way you interpret that is, I hear voices. They aren't me. It wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. To the voice within that can, if you attend to it, align you with the structure of reality itself, that internal voice being a manifestation of God. And I think that's an extremely powerful argument. And I think it's right.
There are different Baals, but the one associated with the prophet Elijah is Baal-zebub, or who we now refer to as Beelzebub. Baal appears in demonology and the occult. Aleister Crowley penned a poem in which he referred to hating Jehovah, the God of Israel. Crowley was a rabid anti-Semite, and loving Baal, who he depicted as our Father and our Lover and our God. Remember, Crowley's God was Satan, and Crowley believed he could communicate with and was possessed by Satan. Indeed, Crowley thought that he could hear God's voice, and that's because, like Peterson, he was almost certainly schizophrenic. In this video, you saw Jordan Peterson talking about his two favorite subjects, Nazism and Satanism. You watched as he complimented the SS, expressed empathy for a theoretical Nazi guard who reveled in his death camp duties, and likened Canadian democracy to totalitarianism. You observed him side with anti-trans protesters, the Freedom Convoy, whose leaders had connections to neo-Nazism, and India's Narendra Modi concerning the diplomatic rift that occurred after Trudeau effectively accused Modi of facilitating the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. More importantly, you watched as Peterson practically admitted to praying to Satan, while Piers Morgan vacuously nodded along, content that Peterson believed in God. As I detail in The Devil and His Due, Jordan Peterson is a narcissist and schizophrenic who believes he's possessed by Satan and is Hitler's son. Of course he's neither. Rather, such beliefs are the product of his mental illness. My name is Troy Parfit, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe.